Now we're going to take a look at a concept known as the zero value in Go. And to understand the zero value, we also have to understand initialization. So we're going to learn about the zero value and initialization in this video. But to understand those things, we have to do a little bit of review about declaring and assigning. So this is the code we worked with in the previous video. And here we are declaring a variable is of type int. So we are declaring a variable is of type int, right? And we could even say declaring a variable with the identifier of z is of type int. So that's the identifier. But the important thing is we're declaring a variables of type int. And here we are assigning a value to that variable, right? We're assigning a value to that variable. And the variable is declared to hold values of a certain type. The variable is declared to hold values of type int, and here we are assigning a value of type int to that variable. If we tried to assign some other value of a different type, like we tried to assign this here, right, that's not going to work. It's going to say, cannot use bond type string as type int in assignment. You can only use type int to assign to that variable because that variable's declared to hold values of type int. That's static programming language. So declare a variable is of type int and assign a value to that variable. But we're here to learn about the zero value and also initialization. So first let's take a look at initialization. So initialization is just the initial time that you assign a value to a variable. That's known as initialization. And so here we have the word assign. We could also call this initialization if we wanted. And if we go look up what initialization means in programming, initialize, programming, define, and we look at Wikipedia, we could see here initialization. In computer programming, initialization is the assignment of an initial value for a data object or variable. That's the initial way that you could think about initialization. It's the first time that you assign a value to a variable. You're initializing that variable. You hear this word initialization used in this way. And just a little bit of context on that. Things in a computer are stored in memory. And we'll learn more about computers if you're new to all of this in a section which people who are experienced can skip, where I'll teach you about how computers work and binary and coding schemes and all of that. But here is in a computer you have memory. And memory is like a big post office with a bunch of P.O. boxes. And each of those P.O. boxes has an address. And you could store things in each P.O. box, right? And then you have all of these values stored in different P.O. boxes, and that's how memory works. And they each have their own address, just like a post office box has its own address. So the first time that you store a value in memory, that's called initialization. It's the initial time you're storing a value in memory. You're initializing memory. You're storing that value there. So you could also say assign or initialization, but initialization really has the connotation, the implication of it's the initial time that you're storing that value in memory, and you're initializing memory, right? You're initializing it. So you're saying this memory right here is holding this value. So what would happen if we didn't assign a value to z? We're just declaring a variable is of type int. What happens when we run this, it's going to print out 0. Cool, so the 0 printed out. So every type in Go has a 0 value. So if you declare a variable to be of a certain type, we want to initialize memory and we want to store that in memory. But if we haven't assigned an initial value, the compiler is going to assign that value for us, and that's known as the 0 value. So for an int, it's 0, and for a string, it's the empty string. For all of the other values, you could find them in the language specification. So 0 for integers, false for bools, 0, 0 for floats, empty for strings, and nil for pointers, functions, interfaces, slices, channels, and maps. And we'll learn more about this as we go through this course. So that's what the 0 value is. If you go look at the language specification and look for 0 value, you'll find all of that right here. Each element of such a variable or value is set to the 0 value for its type. False for bools, 0 for integers, and then the same thing that I just pointed out over there. So when storage is allocated for a variable, either through a declaration or a call of new, or when a new value is created either through a composite literal or a call of make, and no explicit initialization is provided, the variable or value is given a default value. So that's the 0 value. So when storage is allocated, memory, when memory is allocated for a variable and no explicit initialization is provided, so you haven't provided, like, I'm going to store this value there, you haven't assigned a value to that variable, then it provides one for you, and that's the 0 value. So the 0 value is important. You'll use that in your programming. When you see things like var z int, you'll know that somebody needs a variable there, and it's getting the 0 value, which for an int is 0, and they have not yet assigned a value to it, so they didn't initialize it with a value. But that's what the 0 value is, and it's a concept you need to be aware of, and which we'll build on as we go through the rest of this course and as you program in Go.